Sometimes the attacks don't come as shouting or a direct accusation. They arrive disguised as just a reminder. Someone brings up an old episode, an earlier version of you that no longer exists, and places it on the table as if it defines who you are today. The impact is immediate, not because you haven't moved on, but because certain words still touch sensitive places. For a moment, it can feel like the entire road you've walked gets reduced to an old label, and that throws your inner order off in a way that's hard to explain. That emotional jolt often comes with a quiet question. Why does this still hurt? You know you've changed, you know you learned, you know you kept going, and yet hearing your past used like a weapon creates a specific kind of tension. It's different from present-day criticism, which you can evaluate, discuss, or correct. This kind of attack is trying to pull you backward. It's not questioning what you do now. It's questioning who you are, based on something that no longer represents your life. That's where many people get tangled. They start explaining, justifying, trying to prove growth. Others go silent and swallow their anger. In both cases, the result is often the same, the feeling of losing your center. Serenity gets confused with passivity, and reaction gets confused with strength, as if answering immediately were dignity and staying whole were weakness. That trap is common, especially when the attack hits something that once carried shame or real pain. Marcus Aurelius dealt daily with accusations, rumors, and judgments about past decisions. And still, he didn't live in explanation mode. He understood something essential. No one can hurt you with your past if you no longer live there. An emperor doesn't govern by looking back for approval. He governs the present, sustaining his current actions with coherence. What was behind him didn't need to be renegotiated every time someone tried to provoke him. Epictetus went even further. For him, only a slave reacts to what he can no longer control. The past can't be changed, but how you respond when someone drags it into the room is still in your hands. The attack only gains power when it meets an automatic reaction, when it meets someone who feels obligated to defend what no longer defines their identity. That's the center of this video. It isn't about denying the past or pretending it never happened. It also isn't about hardening yourself or shutting down. It's about learning to respond with serenity, without justifying yourself, without shrinking, without stepping into debates that lead nowhere. It's about keeping emotional dignity when someone tries to use your history as a tool of control. Because when you know who you are today, the past loses the power to govern you in the present. It's common, when you're confronted with old mistakes, to feel an urgent need to explain, to show you've evolved, list what you learned, prove with words that it's behind you. But that impulse is rarely effective. In trying to convince the other person, you end up being pulled back into that past yourself. Over-explaining doesn't free you. It tightens the connection to what no longer makes sense. What's really happening is an ego defense. Your mind wants to protect your current image, correct the other person's impression, restore what feels threatened. But that emotional defense doesn't always preserve dignity. Often, in trying to repair someone else's view of you, you lose your internal calm. You start moving not from what you know, but from what you feel pressured to prove. Marcus Aurelius didn't fall into that. He didn't spend his energy negotiating his identity. His conduct spoke louder. He lived by present principles. The past, its pain and its lessons, was part of the journey, not the script. Self-governance required presence, not justification. You've likely experienced this. Someone brings up an old failure, hoping for guilt, shame, or an emotional reaction, and you feel pushed to respond. But in many cases, the strongest response is calm silence, an inner recognition that it was lived, processed, and closed, that it doesn't need to be relived. That stance has an immediate effect. The attack loses force. What doesn't meet defensive explanation doesn't get oxygen. The provocation collapses when there's no story for it to grow into, and you remain whole, centered in who you are, not in what you used to be. A lot of people confuse taking responsibility with accepting humiliation. One thing is recognizing what you did with honesty and maturity. Another, very different thing, is allowing that recognition to become a tool to put you beneath someone else. The line is subtle, but it's the line that decides whether the memory of a mistake becomes a bridge to growth. For years, you may have allowed certain people to drag the past back whenever they wanted to shake you, and out of habit, you accepted it. You apologized again, you explained again, You felt guilty again. But that repetition isn't responsibility. It's a loss of discernment. Epictetus helps reorganize this. For him, owning what was yours doesn't mean accepting someone else's judgment as truth. There's an inner space where you can acknowledge an error without placing yourself below. That space is factual neutrality. No inflated emotion, no self-punishment, no need to persuade anyone. Maybe you felt this in a relationship, in your family, at work. You apologized, you corrected what you could, and yet the other person keeps bringing it up, keeps trying to lock you into a version of you that no longer exists. In moments like that, responding with serenity and precision is what keeps you standing. Separating responsibility from humiliation is a deep form of self-respect. It protects your energy, it preserves your sense of worth, and it interrupts the cycle of emotional submission that blocks real growth from ever taking root. There's a mistaken idea that change is only real when other people notice it and validate it, and that for them to validate it, you have to explain every step, narrate every lesson, defend every choice. But real growth doesn't require justification. It requires lived coherence. Real change doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need applause. What weakens attacks based on the past isn't a better argument, it's the solidity of the present. When your current actions are consistent, steady, and calm, the past stops sticking. Old versions become irrelevant, not through denial, but through lack of use. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply. He didn't defend himself against every criticism. He didn't reopen old judgments. He continued. He governed with constancy. He reaffirmed his values in daily life, and in doing so, he showed who he was without announcing it. You may have noticed this in your own life. When you're unstable, any old memory can shake you, but when you're centered, certain of what you're building, the same memory has nowhere to land. The past might be mentioned, but it no longer finds a home. Letting your actions speak is a quiet way of ending discussions without extending conflict. Over time, people notice. They may not praise it, they may not admit it, but they feel it, because no one can argue for long with the coherence of a stable presence. And in the long run, the dynamic changes. The past stops being used as a weapon, not because others became better, but because you no longer move to its commands. The past only keeps hurting when it still takes up space in your identity, when it still dictates your response, when it still finds in you the need to be reopened. Real change is when what you lived loses the power to decide who you are. Marcus Aurelius shows what it means not to renegotiate what you've already outgrown. He didn't chase public repair. His dignity lived in the present, in how he acted, how he thought, how he held his conduct under pressure. Epictetus completes the picture by reminding us that freedom begins where reactivity ends. Reacting to what can't be changed is staying chained to invisible ropes. You don't have to erase your past to be whole. You just can't allow it to keep writing your now. Not justifying yourself sometimes is the deepest act of emotional maturity, because it shows you've already faced it, already reorganized, already chosen a different path. And someone who is at peace with their own story isn't afraid of people talking about it. What keeps you steady isn't forgetting what happened. It's refusing to lose yourself again trying to fix what has already been lived. And in that space of serenity, you return to governance, not over the past, but over yourself. And that's enough, because the person who governs himself doesn't need defense, only presence. And that can't be used against you, or an emotional weapon.